meantime, please make sure that you set your interpretation to your language of choice. You can do this at the bottom of your screen if you're using Zoom on a laptop. Click the interpretation button. We have simultaneous interpretation in English, French, Russian, Portuguese, and Spanish. If you are using your mobile, you can do this by pressing the three little dots and selecting interpretation from there. Again, welcome to those just joining us. You're in the right place. This is the ITUC's 2025 release of its Corporate Underminers of Democracy. We will begin shortly. We're waiting for more people to come in from the waiting room. While you wait, you can adjust your interpretation using the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen. We have simultaneous interpretation in English, French, Russian, Spanish, and Portuguese. If you're using your mobile, you can do this by pressing the three little buttons at the top of your screen and selecting interpretation and then your language of choice. I'll do this 2 more times. So again, thank you to those of you who have joined us already. You're in the right place. This is the ITUC's release of its 2025 Corporate Underminers of Democracy list. While we wait for a few more people to enter from the waiting room, you can set your interpretation to your language of choice. We have English, Spanish, Russian, Portuguese, and French. And we will begin shortly. And again, one last time, this is the ITUC's Corporate Underminers of Democracy call. You're in the right place. We'll begin in just 1 minute. So please, while you wait, set your interpretation to your language of choice. We have English, Spanish, Russian, Portuguese, and French. You can do this at the bottom of your screen if you're using Zoom on a laptop, or you can do this using the three little buttons at the top of your phone and selecting interpretation. Okay, let's get started, everybody. Welcome, everyone, to the release of the ITUC's 2025 list of corporate underminers of democracy. My name is Todd Brogan. I'm the Director of Campaigns and Organizing at the ITUC, and I'll be moderating today's call from South Africa, where I'm with our comrades and colleagues from COSATU, which is the largest trade union confederation in the country, and who are all too familiar with some of the names we'll be discussing today. To get started, I'm dropping a link in the chat to the report, which is being published right now, simultaneous with this webinar. You're welcome to open it and peruse it during my introduction, but we'll hope you'll pay close attention when we get to the speakers. I'll start by answering a question, which is, what is the Corporate Underminers of Democracy list and why is it important? In 2024, the ITUC launched its global campaign for democracy. And in it, we laid out an expansive workers' vision for democracy at work, in society, and in global institutions. Across the world, on picket lines, in parliaments, at rallies, and in global meetings, trade unions strive to practice a deep form of democracy, one that prioritizes mass participation and the delivery of concrete improvements in people's lives. Through their unions, workers collectively set the course in their communities, in their workplaces, in their countries, in their international institutions. Unfortunately, the vast majority, some 90% of the world's workers, are denied access to that kind of democracy at work. And this denial, combined with this, what we all see, the accelerating failure of existing institutions to deliver what working people need, has created an opening for anti-democratic forces to seize the narrative and to seize power. We call this a billionaire coup against democracy, and it's led by the uber rich, by tech elites, and far-right political forces. They're exploiting the weaknesses of governments and international institutions. They're amassing unconscionable wealth. They're destroying the social bonds that bind working people together, and they're sowing economic and environmental destruction wherever they go. That's why last year the I2C launched the first edition of Corporate Underminers of Democracy. It's an annual selection that we make of emblematic companies that violate trade union and human rights, that consolidate industry power or monopolize it, that evade taxes and social responsibility, that subvert popular will and policy through intensive lobbying, who exacerbate climate catastrophe. And this is the critical thing that separates corporate underminers from other projects. They actively invest a portion of the profits they extract in far right political forces. When the far right wins power, we know it discredits and defunds global institutions. We see this playing out now, the United Nations or in the ILO. But they also reduce taxes on the wealthy and on corporations. They undercut living wages for workers. They crack down on human, trade union, and democratic rights. And this is we show every year in the ITUC's annual Global Rights Index. This vicious cycle is driven by greed, and it impacts freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, union organizing campaigns, political elections, negotiations between workers and employers on every continent. The companies on this list are not are representative rather, but they are by no means alone. They signify what we view as a wider corporate world that protects and expands its own profits by undermining democracy in every sphere of life. The 2024 edition that we released last year, we tried to show the pervasiveness of this anti-democratic behavior. It implicated institutional investors, private equity, big tech companies, automotive firms, heavy industry giants. But for this year's list, we focused on the rising threat to democracy posed by major and emerging players in the global armaments industry, those who are combining new technology, support for authoritarian politics in really frightening ways. In 2025, these companies are helping to enable growing militarism that we see all over in every hemisphere. They're demanding egregious deregulation from national governments and from international institutions. They're overseeing declines or leading outright opposition to workplace democracy, to workers organizing unions. And they're helping to roll back the modest progress that we've made over the last 80 years towards pluralist democracy and peace. So this year, 7 companies really stood out from the rest. And I should say how we go about this. What we do is we work with allies, allied organizations, corporate watchdogs, the global union federations, one of which you'll hear from today. But we also work with the Progressive International and a group called the Autonomy Institute. And with them, we developed this really incredible tool that maps connections between far-right political actors and corporate leadership in corporations. And this tool allows us to really have a look at what kinds of meetings they're attending together, like conservative political action network meetings that have spread across the globe in the last few years. It helps us see where they're making what I want to say, where they're settling contracts or negotiating new funding for projects for these companies. And so we go through this very rigorous process of consultation, but also of original research. And we find those and we name those that really stand out from the rest. And this year, there were 7 companies when we looked at this intersection of new technology and militarization in the far right. There were 7 companies that really stood out from the rest. They are SpaceX. Many of you will already be familiar with SpaceX. It's owned by far-right billionaire Elon Musk, and it's now deeply embedded in military planning and deployments in countries around the world, most notably the United States. And we all know and have seen for ourselves, because he's very public about it, how the profits that Musk reaps from his company are then channeled into far-right political projects. The second company is Palantir. This is owned by another far-right billionaire, Peter Thiel, who was also an original financier of Facebook when it was, or Meta when it was Facebook. And Palantir over the last 2 decades has really become the de facto data operating system for warfare, for policing, for immigration enforcement, for intelligence analysis. The third is one you probably haven't heard of, and that's Anduril. They're perhaps they're perhaps the least known, but by no means the least troubling. They are described by some as, quote, straddling the line between hacker culture and hawkish, meaning pro-war ideology. And their niche, their corporate niche, is building what I can only describe as dystopian autonomous killing machines. The fourth company we name this year is Meta. We named Meta last year, but this year we looked at Meta from a different perspective, its relationship to militarism. And of course, we find that not only is the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, accelerating the pivot of the company towards the far right, but he's also opening the doors for military contractors and states to use the data that comes out of Meta for military and intelligence purposes. The fifth is Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman is the single largest nuclear weapons profiteer, and we're living in a time where countries are talking about modernization of nuclear weapons, which means proliferation of nuclear weapons. And while they may be more sophisticated in disguising their politics than younger peer companies like the ones I've just named, they nonetheless do finance far-right figures who oppose multilateralism, arms control, peace treaties, and trade unions. The sixth company we name is Amazon, also returning to our list from last year. But like with Meta, we looked at them from a different angle and we found just as troubling of information. So, of course, billionaire Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon, has made a point of trying to cozy up with a lot of far right leaders around the world. But Amazon itself as a company also regularly hosts defense industry events. It markets itself as Amazon for warfighters, and it joins other tech industry players in trying to figure out how to grow the revenue that they get from tax dollars through the arms industry while platforming and associating with far right figures. And the last company we named this year, also a returning from last year, is Vanguard. Workers all over the world, especially where I come from in the United States, might know Vanguard because our retirement money is invested by Vanguard. Um, but they are also the largest investor in nuclear weapons production in the world. They're also notorious for not really cooperating with investors or activists who are trying to move the company's investments in more ethical directions. Well, we all know the rival in the industry, the rival institutional investor BlackRock, they've actually been trying to engage a little bit. It's not to apologize for BlackRock, but Vanguard immediately abandoned its environmental and social governance pledges, and it has worked really hard to curry favor with the American far right by pretending to be above and outside of this politics. So together, these companies, these corporate underminers, expose how political opportunism and corporate profiteering are really hollowing out democracy, fueling militarization, and also why workers and unions struggling for democracy has never been more urgent. Now, what I've just given you in the last 10 minutes is the 10,000-foot view. But to really understand how these companies are having an effect, a negative effect on democracy, we really need to hear from the people and the organizations that are on the front lines of these struggles. And that's why I'm really excited for our panel today. We're going to hear from several panelists. We're not going to talk about every company on the list. You have the link, which I'll post in the chat again. But we are going to talk to those who are very familiar with some of them. First, I'll just introduce the names and affiliations of the speakers, and then I will begin by asking some questions of each of our speakers. At the end, we'll have time for Q&A from you in the audience. So as they speak, if you have a question, there's a Q&A function. There's also a chat function. So please put your questions in as they come, and we'll bring them at the end, as many as we can cover. So our speakers today are going to be Sonia Kigomo from Africa Tech Workers Rising, which is affiliated with UNI and the CWU in Kenya. She's going to talk with us about Meta, and she has incredible firsthand experience with how Meta is operating around the world. We'll also hear from Nick Rudikoff from UNI Global Union about Amazon. We'll hear from Susie Snyder from the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, about companies like Northrop and Vanguard. We'll hear a little bit from Quintino Severo at CUT Brazil, about how companies like SpaceX are meddling in national democracies, including in Brazil. We were going to be joined today by David Adler from the Progressive International, which is one of our partners in this, but David is currently aboard a flotilla en route to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza. So we're sending our solidarity and our hope for safe transit, but I will take the role of speaking a little bit about Palantir so that we don't miss that contribution. And then last but certainly not least, we're going to look beyond the companies on this list. While we didn't name any French companies, there are far-right billionaires using their profits to poison national politics, using their corporate arms to poison national politics all over. And we're going to hear from Emmanuel from CGT France, specifically about a couple of them that are doing this kind of work in France. And maybe we will consider their companies for next year's list. So with that, I'm going to first turn to Sonia. Sonia, this is the second year that we've named Meta a corporate underminer of democracy. And I know you've worked on the front line of Meta's subcontracted content moderation operations. And I was reading some of what you've written before. You've said publicly that things have only gotten worse over time. So can you tell us where things stand with Meta today for content moderators across Africa, and a little bit about what workers are doing to fight for some measure of democracy at work against this company? Sonia, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Todd, and good afternoon to everyone. Like Todd has already introduced me, my name is Sonia. I am based in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm from South Africa. I'm a former Facebook content moderator I was under the BPO called Summer. So just to give you a little bit of a background before maybe I just answer the question of where is Facebook right now and what's happening, what are we doing, and content moderators. So as I've stated earlier before, I'm a former Facebook content moderator, and me as a former Facebook moderator, what I was doing my day-to-day life, again, bit of background, I was moderating some of the most gruesome content, the most horrific content that the eye can ever see, basically. And all of this I was doing for $2 an hour. I was doing all of this, me and my colleagues, with no proper mental health support. And I did this for over 2 years because I started in 2021 up until 2023, when my colleagues and I were all fired abruptly. Sorry. So when my colleagues and I were fired abruptly, this is when it all ended. And the firing basically came shortly after we had started demanding or asking for the company to allow us to recognize a union, to allow us to be part of a union. So as a content moderator, basically as soon as we started a movement and the movement gained momentum to say we would like to have a union in the workplace, and that's where in less than a month we were all fired, basically. So as content moderators, we felt that it's very important and to have a union, because we felt that everything that we were facing in the workplace, we had no platform to raise our concerns, and we had no platform to ask for help or demand for better working conditions without being intimidated or victimized or being dismissed. Because every time someone would raise like some sort of issue or concern, you are basically one step away from being out of the door. So a little bit of what content moderators in Africa or in Kenya, what they go through. And I'm saying this because I'm a former content moderator. I know this because I was working there for over 2 years. So a day-to-day life of a content moderator is basically, on average, you work for like about 10 hours a day. We worked an average of 10 hours a day for $2 an hour. As I've said earlier, we interact with very traumatic content on a daily basis, from reviewing hate speech child sexual exploitation, mutilated human beings, decaying human beings, and all of this, as mentioned, we are all doing this with no proper mental health support. And sadly, we have lost so many colleagues. We've lost so many colleagues to, I don't know whether to say lost or succumbed. Yeah, so many colleagues unfortunately succumbed to PTSD. Some that was caused by the work, the nature of the work. Some have lost the battle to alcohol and drug abuse, and while some even went to an extent of attempting suicide. And yeah, that's how bad actually the content was, the after effects of the content were. And unfortunately, if you do not have proper mental health support. So as content moderators, yes, we desperately wanted to have a platform that will help us fix the conditions, that will help us fix the conditions in the workplace. We wanted better pay. We wanted to have living wages. We felt that $2 an hour was not realistic with today's economy. We wanted to be protected as we do this job, and we needed to have proper mental health support and assessments, basically, from professionals who were specialized in trauma. We also felt a strong need that we are doing so much the work that it's so traumatic, and we are doing it for, you get burned out before even we were doing it for long hours. So we also wanted to have normal working hours, like an average of 8 hours a day, as the contract has stated, but that was not the case. And because we do more than 8 hours with no compensation, no overtime, no nothing. And also we wanted to have a voice to speak and not be restricted and intimidated by an NDA that we had to sign when we come into the workplace, that often gets used as a way of silencing us to speak anything. And we wanted to have a job. And part of the reasons why we wanted to speak out is because we wanted to have this job recognized. We wanted this, platform workers or content moderation, we wanted it to be recognized and regulated. We wanted to have legislation that recognizes and protects us from, both the health department, health and safety department, or the employment and labor departments, because we felt that we are basically like the frontline defense that protects the rest of the world from ever coming into contact with such content. And for that, we felt that it's only fair that we get compensated fairly. And as you had mentioned also earlier, something about some of these companies fueling the political, I'll also mention as in something that happened, I think it was in 2021 in November, where one of our colleagues there was coming from a country that during that time was having, it's a high risk, high country, high war country. And this is actually, he was coming from Ethiopia, and during that time there was just so many so much unrest in the country, and there were circulations of threats, bullying, violence, and inciting. And in most of the cases, or some cases, we would notice as moderators that it seems like when you are trying to take this content down, it doesn't go down. It's almost like the algorithm, it feeds on such things. It's almost like, I mean, this is in the middle of a war. This is very dangerous, but it seems like it doesn't take it down. It's more like it's fueling all of this. So unfortunately, I had a colleague who sadly lost his father by the gate. He got shot, and this was because the father was shot and in front of his gate just before he entered this gate. And this is shortly after, because also remember, this job as we are doing it, to some of our colleagues that come from countries that are, high risk countries, war countries, it's, they become a target to local community gangs when they realize that they are responsible for taking down their content. we've had a lot of instances where you would find some of the colleagues have to go in hiding, maybe you work from home or work from a friend's place, or just sort of like in hiding for a short period of time after, because there has been a lot of verified, I would say, verified threats from these local gangs, or that would say, we are looking for such and such a person, and if we find you, the violence and incitement. So unfortunately, in the case of this colleague of mine, the gangs were not able to track him down as he was in hiding. And after some months of threats and posting on Facebook and taking things down, unfortunately, they were able to then get to the father. And how they got to the father, there was a lot of circulation of these threats on Facebook and pictures. And even us as colleagues, when we tried to take down this content, it was not being taken down. You take it down, and then it's almost like the algorithm it pops up again, and then it continues to go live. So the disturbing thing is, yeah, we got to realize that it seems like when a country is in the middle of a war, it's it seems like the algorithm fuels this, is it thrives on this, because again, when this is happening, then it causes, a lot of people would now come into Facebook, and the more people are the more people are interacting with the platform, the more the platform makes money. So if the platform is just going to be peaceful, and it's basically, yeah, it thrives on such things. So currently, what is happening, like I had mentioned earlier, that as content moderators, we desperately felt we wanted a place to express, to speak out, to be recognized, to have legislation, to be, all of these things, to have better living conditions, better pay, and all of that. So unfortunately, yes, we got fired before much could happen. But currently, what is happening, my colleagues and I, some who still strongly feel and stand by the cause, do feel that, yes, platform workers still do need the recognition of, they need to speak out. It's a sector that there's a lot of exploitation going on there, and as much as there's a lot of exploitation, it is not spoken about much. And maybe not because they do not want to speak. Maybe it could be that it's most likely because of the NDAs. We are being made to sign NDAs that half of the time you don't even understand what you're signing, and they don't even explain to you what exactly are you signing for. Instead, the little explanation you get is more like a threat. Like, if you do talk about what you do, who's your client, and you could fail, you could be sued, or you could face some jail time. So it's not much of an explanation. It's basically more of a threat. If you do this, then you will, consequences will be heavy. So yeah, currently in Kenya, content moderators and platform workers in general, we're trying to organize them. Content moderators are open to now being part of a union, because we got to realize that without a union, we as workers, not just platform worker, but yeah, general, I'll just speak on this one because this is where I was. Without a union, without someone to represent you, without a platform where you can be able to air your concerns and get representation on a neutral basis, literally you will not, we won't be able to win this. I mean, you are fighting against big tech companies who've got, I mean, they can. So we recognized the importance of having a union, and the importance of also platform workers coming together and being part of a union. And currently, I'm very happy to see that platform workers are being, with the help of Uni Global, there's a campaign or project that currently I am engaged with now, I'm busy with now, that is supported by Uni Global, to make sure that it continues. Platform workers continue to be, we continue to mobilize and organize, and make sure that these platform workers, content moderators, do get their right of being part of a union, because it's not like they don't want to. We wanted to, but it was just something that was basically denied to us. And when the louder we spoke, the harder we fought, then they fired us. And then now you are from different countries. You have no choice but to basically you just scatter the whole movement. So yeah, currently where we are, it's a matter of like I said, a project that we're being assisted or supported by Uniglobal. It's content moderators and platform workers in Kenya. It's a big milestone that they're being organized for the first time ever in the continent. It has never happened. There has never been a union that actually recognizes them. So this is one of the first, and it's a very proud moment for us.
That's incredible, Sonia. First, thanks for sharing those stories, especially about your colleague who lost his father. This is something that we uncovered last year in the when we looked into Meta and Facebook, was this the way the algorithm seemed to behave in certain conflicts. So I'm really glad you raised that. Now we're going to come back to in the Q&A hopefully, but I want to move to your colleague from Uni, Nick. Nick, this is the second year we've had to put Amazon on this list. Um, this year, last year we talked about all of the things that everyone who follows Amazon knows people are saying about Amazon, its treatment of workers. And this year we really focused on the troubling intersections that it has with the war machine, and that it's really a product of its own massive lobbying effort on both sides of the Atlantic. And in our report, we also noted that Uni has called on the EU to cancel its contracts with Amazon Web Services for a host of different reasons. So can you just catch us up? Tell us more about how Amazon is really digging into public coffers at the expense of workers and communities.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks to the ITUC for doing this important work. Um, you know, Unfortunately, Amazon's a company that, until we really make some serious change in our world, is going to keep appearing on your list because they're so well positioned in so many important markets, so many important businesses that are really central to the global economy. And it abuses its position in these markets. I'm speaking here about logistics, I'm talking about e-commerce and cloud computing. And it wouldn't, as a trade union, I don't think it'd be right to get into this conversation without noting, for the record, how deeply anti-union this company is. We all know that workers in New York City voted for a union probably 4 years ago. Amazon refuses to bargain. We know that Amazon is challenging the legality of U.S. labor law, bringing a case to Trump's right-wing Supreme Court in an effort to destabilize workers' rights in the United States. And then I don't want to harp on this too long, but then, just this last year, workers in Canada at the CSN union in Quebec voted for a union. We're in a process of negotiations with Amazon that was about to conclude with a mandatory binding arbitration of the first contract that would have given the workers a 20% or something increase in their pay. And Amazon responded by shutting down its operations in Quebec and walking away from the workers. 2,000 plus job losses, direct and indirect workers. So Amazon's resistance to letting workers have any democratic voice on the job is, I think, the starting point for us in analyzing Amazon's anti-democratic behavior around the world. But so to get closer to your questions, Todd, Amazon, was doing its best to maximize its profits for years at the expense of democracy and public good. And it did this under multiple governments in different parts of the world. Now, with the rise of the Trump administration in the United States, you're seeing a really pernicious cozying up to authoritarianism of the Trump administration. You're seeing an unholy alliance between oligarchs and authoritarians that is truly a chilling threat to democracy around the world. Now, some of this just takes the form of what appears to be straight up corruption. For example, Amazon paying Donald Trump's family personally tens of millions of dollars for the rights to air, to produce a documentary about Donald Trump's wife, Melania Trump. Then you have Amazon buying the rights to Trump's TV show, The Apprentice, to rerun it for an undisclosed sum. So we can't even estimate what that payment was, and we'll probably never find out. And then you see Jeff Bezos personally gutting one of the United States' most important newspapers, the Washington Post, turning it into a mouthpiece for libertarian individualist rights against unions, against democracy, firing journalists um, or offering payouts to journalists who refuse to toe the new party line, which is uh, pro-Trump, pro-capitalism. So you see how this, how the wealth of Amazon and the wealth of Bezos personally is going to pave the way for a compliant response to the Trump administration. Now, what are the results of this? Well, certainly it'll mean that Amazon will face less scrutiny from the U.S. government in terms of its monopolistic business practices. Um, and certainly it's resulted in a multi-billion-dollar contract between NASA, the U.S. space agency, and Jeff Bezos's personal, privately owned spaceship company, Blue Origin. So it's rank corruption. It's fundamentally anti-democratic, and at the core of it is a deep, deep resentment of unions and worker democracy, which I think suggests the important role we play as trade unions in this world, fighting for democracy, both in the workplace and in our societies and economies at large. So I don't, I want to talk a bit about the fight back, because I think it's important to recognize that we are fighting, workers are fighting, unions are fighting, our allies are fighting around the world, and this fight is not over. But before I do that, I think I'd be remiss in not mentioning, since the subject of this call relates to militarism, the important role that Amazon plays in the defense industry around the world, and specifically the ways that Amazon is aiding the Israeli government and the IDF in the occupation in the occupied territories in Palestine. So Amazon has, along with Google, a huge contract to provide cloud computing services to the IDF, and that internet, that data infrastructure, is central to any modern military effort around the world. And so I just think it's important. Amazon tech workers have called Amazon out for the role it's playing in the occupation. And I think that it would be unfortunate not to mention that at this point. But the fight back does continue. And of course, we're fighting in the workplaces. We're organizing. We're organizing in India against unsafe working conditions. We're standing with our allies in India to tell the Indian government to not give Amazon a blank check to extract value from the Indian country, like so many Western colonial powers have done in the past. And so recently, Amazon was lobbying for increased investment opportunities in India, to expand its role as a retailer and seller of goods in India. And we joined with traders groups, with hawkers, with uni affiliates and data rights experts to say to the Indian Ministry of Commerce, we should not do this. Earlier, a couple of years ago, we did the same thing around the Reserve Bank of India, calling on the Reserve Bank of India to not allow Amazon increased latitude in business in the digital payments processing space. And in Brussels, Uni Europa and our allies in Brussels have been waging a fight to ensure that Amazon respects the democratic institutions of the European Parliament. And for years, Amazon has refused to testify at the European Parliament's Committee on Employment Rights, the MPEL committee. And this last, just a few months ago, the MPEL committee again invited Amazon to come testify about its labor rights record, to sit down in a democratic space with trade unionists, workers, and health and safety experts. And Amazon refused to send a senior executive to Brussels to testify. They wanted to send someone who had very, very little power within the Amazon organization. And the committee specifically asked for a senior level manager who could come and who had actual decision-making authority, and who could actually speak to Amazon's practices. which, by the way, originate not in Amazon Europe headquarters in Luxembourg, but originate in Amazon headquarters in Seattle. Amazon couldn't do that. They could not make a senior executive available. And so the lobby ban that Uni and its allies fought for at the European Parliament of Amazon lobbyists stands. This is the only second time in history, the first being Monsanto, where a company has been banned from lobbying the European Parliament. And what this shows and symbolizes is that Amazon has to respect democratic norms. They have to respect the people when we're organized in our parliaments, and they need to respect those rights both in the workplace and in our parliaments. And if they don't do that, there's going to be consequences for them. Now, finally, I want to say to everyone on this call, everyone listening here today, Amazon Web Services is likely doing business with your government. And Amazon Web Services is the largest cloud computing company on earth. As I said, cloud computing is central to a lot of modern activities of states, militaries, private sector. And what some uni affiliates and some unions around the world are doing is they're asking their governments why. Why are we giving contracts to a bad actor like Amazon? Doesn't respect workers' rights, acts in a bullying a monopolistic manner, thumbs its nose at democratic norms and institutions. And in Australia, the Commerce Union, the SDA, joined with the TWU, the Transport Union, and with the Australian Council of Trade Unions. And they wrote to their government and they suggested that Amazon does not meet the ethical standard for a company that does business with the state of Australia. We think a lot more countries and unions ought to be looking at these questions. We have a say in a democracy where our tax dollars go and what kind of values we want to support with those tax dollars. So the struggle continues. Thanks again, Todd, for having us on, and we'll be here next year if need be.
Yeah, unless we win in the
Yeah.
meantime, Nick.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much for that in depth. And a lot of those things are even what you mentioned were even new to me, or I saw them in the news somewhere, and amidst all of the terrible news we get, I didn't track. I really appreciate you getting us up to speed on what's happening, and also the Australia example, because a big part of what we want to talk about too is what unions are doing to fight back. We're going to come back to our union colleagues and comrades shortly, but I want to pivot now and hear from Susie, because two companies that we put on this list that don't really fit the almost villainous caricature that you get from talking about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or this panel of people who sat behind Donald Trump in the inauguration earlier this year are Northrop and Vanguard. Northrop Grumman is a well-known legacy armaments company in the United States. It's not the largest in the world, but it does have the distinction of being the largest manufacturer of nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare technology. Some people might think it was weird to put them on this list, but part of what persuaded us was the reports done by ICANN. And same goes with Vanguard. Vanguard we mentioned last year because as we looked into these companies, like Tesla was on last year, another Musk company, we found Vanguard being the tie-breaking vote in an historic compensation package to Musk. So while they, again, put on a face of being a certain type of apolitical investor that's disinterested, they take these actions that put money into the pockets of some of the world's most dangerous people. So we looked at Northrop and we looked at Vanguard, and in part through ICANN's reports, really see how much money they're either making from or putting into the making of nuclear weapons. So what is it, Susie, about these more traditional players that should raise the alarms for working people and those that are concerned about the fate of democracy? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And greetings to all the brothers, sisters, siblings out there. It's really good to be here to be part of this and part of this conversation. Because, I think about democracy a lot. I think about democracy in the context of nuclear weapons, because these are the most undemocratic weapons ever created. These are weapons that are under the control of 9 men who have the ability to destroy life as we know it for every single living being on the planet. 9 men having the power over everyone gives them the sense of godlike immunity and the ability and the desire to act with impunity. And we see them doing that constantly because they control these weapon systems. And yet those people living in the countries where these weapons have been developed have overwhelmingly rejected their ongoing possession. We know these weapons, they're designed to incinerate a city in a flash of light. And we also know that the chances, if one does get used, and the chances that one will be used are higher than they have been in my lifetime. And I'm not as young as I might seem to be, or like to pretend to be. But the chances that one of these will be used is higher than it's been in my life. And it's never just one. Every study of behavioral science, every modeling, every scenario shows one will go and others will follow. And every single one of us has a chance to do something about that. And I'll get to that in a minute. And while we look at that, we also need to identify what we're up against. And that's why I'm so excited that Northrop is in this list, that Vanguard is in this list, because these are some of those we are up against. But the majority of countries in the world have unequivocally declared their opposition to nuclear weapons. So I just want to remind that 98 countries have either signed, ratified, or acceded to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and more are coming. More are coming. So it's really important to think, this is not the will of the majority. They are undemocratic weapons. And there's a global treaty that exists that has a near majority on board it that outlaws the production, manufacture, or development of these weapons. And that's where Northrop Grumman comes into the picture. Because, as Todd said, Northrop is a huge nuclear weapons manufacturer. In fact, they have outstanding right now at least $40 billion in contracts for nuclear weapons manufacture, development, and production. And they have a contract, the single highest paid contract out there, more than a $13 billion contract for a whole new type of nuclear weapon, a new intercontinental ballistic missile system, a new weapon that is buried in silos. And when you think about nuclear bombs, right, you think about either like Hiroshima or Nagasaki, you think bombs dropping from planes, or you think about that iconic image of the emerging, usually through the mist, out of the silo in the ground to hit its target anywhere on the planet in 30 minutes or less. That's what Northrop Grumman is building. That's what they have a prime contract for. And they jigged the system to get that contract. So you talk about undermining democracy. Let me tell you a little bit about what Northrop did to get this contract. First, they eradicated the competition. So when the contract was first being discussed, there were only two companies that the US Air Force was considering, Boeing and Northrop Grumman. Both of them were going to need somebody else to make solid rocket motor fuels. And there's only one company available to do that. And Northrop bought them out, right? So they completely rigged the competition. So they bought out this other company, Orbital ATK. Boeing dropped out. Now, Boeing very rarely admits it can't do something. Let's take that. We all know Boeing is like, no, we'll fix it. But in this case, Boeing dropped out of the competition. Northrop was the only one left. So they got this massive contract, $13 billion contract for one single type of nuclear weapon system for one country. But Northrop is also building nuclear weapons for the Brits. So I just want to be clear, they're an equal opportunity player. They'll play on both sides of the Atlantic. But they did this. They got these contracts, and they bought out the competition, and then the project itself has been going on. Like, they got the contract, the project's been going on, and there are a few opportunities for democratic oversight when it comes to even defense contracts, which are huge. I grew up in the 80s. The $640 toilet seat is something I think about a lot when I think about defense contractors and the craziness that they will bill governments. Like, they will bill governments. They will demand your tax money for insanity, and there's very little accounting afterwards. But even Northrop Grumman triggered in the US what's called the Nunn-McCready Act because they were 37% over budget. They haven't started building these new nuclear weapons yet. Let me be clear. Like, they were supposed to, but they haven't yet done it, and they're almost 40% over budget. They had to do a restructuring. Now, the project is expected to be more than 80% over budget. You would think a project that is 80% over budget would get canceled, but not if the company that's profiting from it is also financing these so-called independent think tanks that are feeding recommendations into the political system on what to do about these situations. And Northrop Grumman is financing the Atlantic Council, the Brookings Institution, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, amongst others, all of whom are supposed to be putting out independent analysis. But that analysis is hard to keep that analysis independent when your paycheck is coming from a company that relies on you saying what they're doing is a good thing. And so those institutions and others publish reports saying things like the United States can't afford to lose a nuclear arms race to China. And let me just be clear, the United States has about more than 5,000 nuclear weapons out there in the world. China has less than 500. The arms race that we're talking about, nobody's starting on the same blocks here. This is not a thing, right? It's something that has been manufactured in order to create the desire, create the assumption of need, create the market so that you can fill it. And Northrop Grumman is one of the companies that is very much involved in doing this. And not only that, right? Because sure, you can publish this, you can get think tanks to publish reports, but that doesn't sway politicians all the time. If it did, we might have a little bit more access and a little bit more power. We have a lot of power, but we'll come to that again. But what Northrop does is they also hire an army of lobbyists, right? And they've spent more than 2024, which is the last year we published the data, they spent more than $10 million on US lobbying efforts alone. And for every dollar that they spent on US lobbying, they earned $350 for nuclear weapons work. It's an excellent return on investment for them, and it's a huge distractor and destructor of democracy for us. And it's endemic across the company. And I think, if you think a company that will undermine competition, it'll buy others to shrink the marketplace, it'll invest in lobbying and pay for think tanks to create justifications for their contracts. I know everybody on this call here today, everybody who's thinking about this is going to read the Corporate Underminers of Democracy report because it's brilliant. And I encourage you to do so. And when you do, take note of this description of Northrop Grumman. Northrop's ideology is calculated and acquisitive, sustaining its nuclear empire by buying influence, weakening democracy at work, and subordinating public interest to the pursuit of profit and power. I don't know which of you or your colleagues wrote that, Todd, but congratulations. Chef's kiss is excellent. But that's Northrop, right? So it's a defense company. We know defense companies do dirty business. We've been cataloging this for years. And one of the tactics that we have used to reduce their hold on our democratic efforts to change and shift policies is through, for example, shareholder action and shareholder resolution. And that's where Vanguard comes into the picture. Because Vanguard's another story. Vanguard is riding whatever wave it can to make as much profit as possible. And it does that because it claims it has a responsibility. It has what's called a fiduciary duty. They have to return the money investors want them to return. But they have, over the last couple of years, we've seen them transit and really they flip-flop all over the place. And one of the things that we've seen them do is they are both being pressured and pressuring others to avoid what has been tagged woke capitalism, right? To stay out of politics, stay out of decisions that affect every single one of us in our lives. And that is not politics. That is just participating in society. And Vanguard cannot avoid participating in society because its absence sends a very clear signal. It is the single largest financier of the nuclear weapons industry, and it holds more than $78 billion in shares and bonds of the companies that are involved in that industry. 78 billion, just to be clear. That's not a little. And the thing is, Vanguard makes hundreds of products available to its customers. right? Vanguard has so much out in the market, and that's why they are this massive asset manager. They provide these products for both institutional and individual customers, and it's mutual funds or ETFs. And some of them actively exclude weapon systems, but whoa, are they hard to find. And some that are marketed as environmentally, socially, or as ESG funds, who give consideration to environmental, social, or governance issues, actually have major investments, both in fossil fuel companies and nuclear weapons producers. And now they're spreading out. And if you look at the responsibility and the questions around labor, those funds score quite poorly, even though they're meant to be much better. And Vanguard's ESG funds have a past history of including even these less than savory companies. And Vanguard does not take its voting instructions from its clients the way that many had hoped major asset managers like Vanguard would. They opened up a possibility of proxy voting some years ago, but that Vanguard has never made that easily available to its clientele. It's very unfortunate that so few of the more than 260 Vanguard funds out there actively exclude companies that are involved in producing illegal weapons like landmines, cluster bombs, biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. And as you pointed out, Todd, at the outset here, Vanguard does have the option of wielding power to change the way companies behave, because brave shareholders do put forward resolutions to annual meetings. And this is so key in shifting company behavior, whether it be resolutions on demanding, for example, human rights assessments, of impact assessments of what that company is actually doing, or as we've seen having some serious impact over the last couple of years, not agreeing to pay the CEO what they want. Voting no on salaries is a great way to shift a company's direction and perspective. But Vanguard has an outsized number of shares, disproportionate influence over this particular way to influence corporate structure and accountability. So not only do they have this problem of mislabeling and misleading, but this inappropriate and disproportionate level of influence that these mega asset managers that like Vanguard have to limit or dictate the terms of debate. And that's a great reason that, to include them here in this list as a corporate underminer of democracy. So you've given these two examples as connected to the nuclear weapons industry, but there are a lot of other reasons for them also to be here on this list today. And I want to bring it back, though, to the fact that using the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, we have seen some good guys. For example, there are more than 130 institutional investors representing more than $4.7 trillion in assets that have rejected using companies like Vanguard to manage their assets or investing directly in the companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons. And those are, they're an unusual ally. And as we look to build democracy at work, in society, in global institutions, we also need to find and engage with those partners and allies with which we can build the future that works for everyone in an equitable way. So and as a representative, I'm really glad that we get to work with ITUC on these efforts, that we get to work and be one of the partners in this joint struggle we have for a world that we want and that we know is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susie. It's a ton of ground to cover in a short period of time between those two massive companies. We're proud to partner with ICANN. I've mentioned in the chat for people the statement that we did together over the summer for people to reference as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to pivot directly to our colleagues first in Brazil and then in France. We've seen from Sonia the effect that these companies have on workers right on the front line in the way that they behave towards workers. We've heard a lot from Nick about what sounds to me like rank corruption developing in the relationship between these companies and far-right political actors. And Susie's talked a lot about this sort of manufacturing of propaganda, for lack of a better word, through think tanks and other means to try to subvert democracy and redirect public revenues into development of these weapons. But I want to turn to Quintino from CUT Brazil, because in our research, we found SpaceX a lot. And SpaceX is known for this really futuristic rocket technology. Even when they explode, it really captures people's attention, understandably so. But a lot of people don't really understand how Elon Musk and people like him use their companies like SpaceX to advance these far-right political goals. And this is not just in the US. This is all over the world. You see in the chat people saying this is happening in Namibia, this is happening in my country, and Brazil is no exception. What really caught my eye, and the reason we've asked Kut to join us, is the company, not Musk, the company itself hosted an influencer named Paulo Figueiredo at its headquarters in Texas. And if you look into this guy just for a little bit, you see how deeply connected he is to former President Bolsonaro, who of course now has been convicted of plotting a coup. So Contino, I turn to you now. What is this kind of meddling in Brazilian politics, and what does it mean for Brazilian workers? The floor is yours.
Bom dia, Todd. Bom dia a todas e todos. Quero agradecer o convite para que nós aqui da CUT Brasil pudéssemos contribuir um pouco com esse debate que me parece extremamente necessário, importante, porque realmente as grandes empresas multinacionais de tecnologia têm ocupado um espaço superior ao poder dos estados constituídos enquanto nações. Realmente, o capital dessas empresas se torna superior ao poder que um estado tem e que um governante tem em nosso continente, e também, evidentemente, em todo o mundo. Bom, para começar, na verdade, quando se fala esse conceito de militarização, não se trata apenas de uma questão de armas, mas também é um conceito que está na mentalidade das pessoas. Há uma mentalidade de militarizar na cabeça das pessoas, no conceito mais interno, mais endógeno, do que realmente se fala em militarização enquanto armas. E a militarização também não se manifesta apenas com armas, mas principalmente com as tecnologias que hoje são utilizadas e que têm vastos contratos com governos e com instituições públicas, e tem uma influência muito forte na política. Esse conceito, portanto, de militarização que eu estou falando, que não é apenas armas, mas também esse conceito muito mais de pensamento militar, ele tem uma influência muito grande na política, e isso se passou muito aqui no Brasil, especialmente. Vou falar um pouco mais na sequência do que aconteceu vem acontecendo nos últimos anos aqui no Brasil e continua tendo uma influência muito forte. Mas queria falar um pouco da influência da Space, de Elon Musk aqui no Brasil. Como falei, não é apenas uma empresa de foguetes, mas ela tem uma influência muito forte na defesa, na exploração espacial, né? Ela consegue essa influência não só do ponto de vista dos foguetes, mas também outras formas de explorar o espaço com a sua atuação e com a sua empresa. Ela não é apenas uma empresa de segurança nacional, mas tem uma forte tecnologia, e principalmente o programa da Starlink, e que tem realmente influência muito forte, está sendo, inclusive, utilizado em guerras, como é o caso da guerra na Ucrânia. Hoje se utiliza essa tecnologia e essa expertise nos ataques que são realizados durante a guerra. Também a gente sabe que a Starlink tem um contrato muito grande com o governo americano, ou seja, não é à toa que Elon Musk, inclusive, participou do governo, porque tem realmente um interesse muito grande e essa relação muito forte com o governo americano. Isso tem influenciado muito, inclusive, a reação do governo aqui no Brasil após a condenação e o processo de condenação do ex-presidente Bolsonaro. Há uma relação muito forte entre Bolsonaro, né, governo americano, mas também Elon Musk neste processo de tentativa de influenciar a política brasileira, mas também de influenciar as decisões do próprio Poder Judiciário em nosso país, aqui no Brasil. Para você ter uma ideia, a Starlink hoje é uma das maiores empresas de comunicação no Brasil. e ela está exatamente colocada em regiões do nosso país onde a forma de comunicação, principalmente a internet, não chega pela estrutura física, de cabos, enfim. Ela, como tem uma tecnologia e a sua transmissão está baseada em formas de satélite, portanto, ela tem possibilidade de atuar em regiões como a região norte do nosso país, no caso a Amazônia, que é um estado, em uma região onde tem difícil acesso terrestre. Então, portanto, a Starlink hoje é uma das empresas que mais tem usuários nas nossas regiões mais longínquas, onde tem mais difícil acesso. Para se ter uma ideia, a Starlink hoje está presente em 5.100 municípios. Nosso país possui 5.570 municípios. E a Starlink está praticamente em o território nacional, com a sua forma de comunicação, com as suas tecnologias de comunicação. Hoje, no Brasil, a Starlink tem cerca de 22 estações terrestres instaladas em todo o território nacional, com capacidade, portanto, de gerar comunicação, de gerar contato, né, e produzir informação e produzir possibilidade de transmissão de dados em todo o Brasil. Para se ter uma ideia, a região sudeste do Brasil, onde está localizados os estados do Rio de Janeiro e São Paulo, que é onde tem a maior população, praticamente do nosso país, são os dois estados mais populosos do Brasil. A Starlink só tem influência no interior dos estados, enquanto que nas capitais, nas grandes regiões metropolitanas, ela não está situada, ela não tem instalação. Por quê? Porque o mercado que ela procura é exatamente o mercado onde está mais distante, mais difícil o acesso da informação pela internet tradicional, por internet por cabo. Então, portanto, esta é uma forma, né, que o Elon Musk, portanto, a Starlink tem de controlar, de acessar a grande população brasileira e principalmente em regiões onde tem mais dificuldade de comunicação e onde tem, portanto, mais dificuldade das pessoas receber as informações de forma mais correta, de forma mais real. Esta é uma capacidade hoje que a Starlink, o Elon Musk tem no sentido de chegar a essas regiões mais longínquas. Quero destacar aqui um pouco também o que tem nos preocupado é que esse processo, esta forma de intervenção, neste jeito de comunicação, principalmente na forma de trazer desinformação à população, nós temos recebido muitas ameaças, ameaças à democracia e aos trabalhadores. Os efeitos deste processo de desinformação têm feito com que haja uma grande dúvida, muitas vezes, das informações que os próprios sindicatos passam para os trabalhadores. Por outro lado, vem um processo muito grande de desinformação através de fake news, que é onde realmente traz um grande prejuízo tanto para a democracia como também para a organização sindical em nosso país. Nesse sentido, nós tivemos recentemente um profundo conflito aqui, porque essa empresa ela se tornou superior, inclusive, à própria legislação brasileira, né? Ela se sobrepõe à legislação, ela enfrentou o judiciário brasileiro, o Elon Musk desrespeitou, através do Twitter, um conjunto de decisões judiciais que impediam, né, ou que exigiam de que a empresa precisava ter representação no Brasil e precisava também tirar do ar um conjunto de desinformação que essa empresa apresentava através do Twitter. Então, portanto, há realmente uma grande ameaça, uma grande preocupação por parte dessas grandes empresas, especialmente da empresa do Elon Musk aqui no nosso país, e com isso tem um conjunto de ameaças, porque traz para os trabalhadores muita desinformação, isso enfraquece o sindicato, isso enfraquece o movimento sindical, também atua de uma forma vigilante e, de certa forma, fiscalizadora dos trabalhadores, porque ela trabalha na perspectiva de monitorar os ativistas, de monitorar os trabalhadores e os militantes políticos, e na tentativa, evidentemente, de intimidá-los com as suas políticas e com a sua ação. Então, portanto, para nós, tem sido bastante importante esse debate sobre as grandes empresas, e creio que esta iniciativa da CSI de fazer esse debate e demonstrar que essa cadeia de empresas tem trazido uma ameaça forte à democracia, e nós aqui no Brasil temos percebido e temos enfrentado essas dificuldades por dois aspectos, aliás, por três aspectos: pela desinformação, né, pelo ataque à democracia e pelo desrespeito à legislação do nosso país em relação ao o que estabelece os meios de comunicação, como é que deve ser a comunicação no nosso país. Então, portanto, queria aqui encerrar dizendo que, para nós tem sido um processo de grande enfrentamento e que vai continuar tendo aqui para nós um processo de grande enfrentamento. No próximo ano, nós temos eleições aqui gerais no Brasil, e, com certeza, mais uma vez, esse processo de desinformação, de fake news, vai influenciar muito na decisão das pessoas, porque tem uma capacidade muito rápida de proliferação da desinformação, e que isso vai fazer com que a gente tenha uma ação muito mais contundente e de muito mais preocupação na perspectiva de garantir que a verdade seja sempre restabelecida e que possamos derrotar essa desinformação. Então, portanto, dizer aqui de que essas empresas, em especial a empresa do Elon Musk no nosso país, tem sido uma empresa danosa para a democracia e para os trabalhadores. É isso que eu gostaria de contribuir nesse sentido. Muito obrigado por essa oportunidade.
Thank you very much, Quintino. Wow. I think we're all going to be watching the Brazilian elections next year very closely. Coming from the United States, it's been like watching two countries handle coup attempts by the far right in very different ways. So we're all very hopeful that Brazil is that the course that Brazil is taking will be successful. But the surveillance piece of this is something I'll be speaking with Kosatu tomorrow in South Africa, and this is one thing that all of these companies we've listed this year are American companies, but they are surveilling, tracking through phones, or in this case, satellite connections, and reaching into the pockets of workers everywhere in every country. And in Brazil, you see a particularly developed, sophisticated example of how they're very much engaged in the national politics, which is a good point to pivot to our final speaker. We did, as I mentioned at the beginning, we did not name any French companies this year, although there are certainly some that would fit into these categories very well. But during our research, we took note of this growing influence of a couple of far-right billionaires in France, who have been using the profits that they've reaped in their executive positions to really insert themselves in ways that we don't really see as direct or as explicit outside of the United States. But these billionaires seem really emblematic of what the I2C has called our billionaire coup against democracy, and really a perfect example of the types of executives who lead all of the corporate underminers we've mentioned this year. So I'm going to turn to Comrade Emmanuel from CGT. Can you tell us a bit more about who these French billionaires are? What are they trying to do? What effect is this having on the French working class, and how is CGT fighting back? The floor is yours.
Oui, merci Todd. Bonjour à toutes et tous. Donc, je suis Emmanuel Vire, membre de la direction de la CGT, et je suis en charge de la lutte justement contre les idées d'extrême droite. Et je suis aussi journaliste de profession, et je suis salarié d'un groupe détenu par un des 2 milliardaires d'extrême droite dont je vais parler aujourd'hui. Je voudrais quand même vous dire d'abord un mot, et c'est en lien évidemment avec l'extrême droite, de la situation politique chaotique en France. Vous êtes sûrement au courant de l'instabilité politique. Le Premier ministre a perdu la confiance du Parlement la semaine dernière. Cette instabilité politique est depuis les élections législatives de 2024 qui ont été perdues par le président Macron, et nous n'avons plus de majorité parlementaire en France depuis le mois de juillet 2024. Nous avons maintenant en France 3 blocs à peu près équivalents. Un bloc de gauche qui ne pèse malheureusement depuis des années que 30 à 35% des voix, un bloc central du centre et de la droite, on va dire, et un bloc d'extrême droite qui malheureusement en France, et je pense que maintenant tout le monde est au courant, progresse depuis 40 ans. C'est depuis 1983 que l'extrême droite est réapparue en France aux élections. Et donc maintenant, l'extrême droite en France, c'est plus de 30% à chaque élection. C'est plus de 9 millions de voix à chaque fois. C'est 34% des voix aux dernières élections parlementaires, 140 députés sur 577. Donc sachez-le, et c'est pour ça que la CGT est très inquiète, il y a un grand risque que le Rassemblement national, le premier parti d'extrême droite en France, héritier du Front national, qui est un parti néofasciste créé par des anciens collaborateurs et des anciens Waffen-SS, remporte les présidentielles en mai 2027. Vous savez que dans ce cadre-là, le gouvernement français a été censuré il y a une semaine, qu'un nouveau Premier ministre de droite a été nommé, qu'il y a une colère sociale très forte en France, qu'il y a eu un grand mouvement le 10 septembre, que l'ensemble des syndicats, les 8 syndicats français, organisent une grève générale jeudi, dans 2 jours, pour répondre au prochain budget voulu par le gouvernement et pour répondre aussi à la montée de l'extrême droite. Alors, si nous luttons évidemment contre la politique antisociale du président Macron, nous avons très peur de prochaines ou de nouvelles élections parlementaires parce qu'évidemment, ce pourrait être la victoire de l'extrême droite. Et vous connaissez les résultats des élections récentes en Europe qui sont où on voit une extrême droite qui progresse très fortement, que ce soit au Portugal, en Roumanie, en Allemagne, en Norvège. Et donc, dans cette conquête du pouvoir, car vraiment la CGT estime qu'il est minuit moins une en France. C'est souvent ce que dit notre secrétaire générale Sophie Binet, il est minuit moins une. Et il faut que tous les camarades à l'international le comprennent. Le pays de la révolution, le pays de la devise liberté, égalité, fraternité est à 2 doigts de tomber dans les droits de l'extrême droite. Et dans ce cadre-là, et j'en viens à mon sujet et la question que m'a posée Todd, le patronat, une partie du patronat français a choisi l'extrême droite et la victoire de l'extrême droite. Et ça, nous l'avons déjà connu en France dans les années 30, avant le régime collaborationniste de Pétain, qui était allié aux nazis. C'était la fameuse expression « plutôt Hitler que le Front populaire ». Et d'ailleurs, pour la première fois cette année, au mois d'août, le mouvement patronal, le patronat français, a invité le Rassemblement national à s'exprimer lors des universités d'été de rentrée du patronat français. Alors, j'en viens à mon sujet et je vais m'intéresser particulièrement donc aux 2 milliardaires français qui essaient de faire basculer la France à l'extrême droite. Le premier, et ils ont engagé une véritable bataille idéologique et culturelle pour faire gagner ces idées en favorisant une union des droites sur un programme libéral, conservateur et xénophobe. Et d'ailleurs, les deux sont en lien avec Trump et ses alliés. Et les deux ont organisé un sommet en France qui s'appelait le Sommet des Libertés le 24 juin. C'était leur première collaboration aux deux, M. Bolloré et M. Sterrin. Et on voit qu'ils se préparent pour que l'extrême droite gagne en 2027. Alors, le premier milliardaire, c'est le plus riche des deux, Vincent Bolloré. C'est d'ailleurs mon patron, sachez-le. Je suis salarié de son entreprise. Et la 11e fortune de France, avec plus de 11 milliards d'euros. Il possède le premier éditeur français, un des premiers éditeurs mondiaux qui s'appelle Hachette. Il possède une des premières agences de communication mondiale qui s'appelle Havas. Il possède des chaînes de télévision, dont Canal+, la première chaîne de financement du cinéma français, une chaîne internationale présente en Afrique, présente beaucoup en Afrique d'ailleurs. La première chaîne d'information en France qui s'appelle CNews, des radios comme Europe 1, le premier groupe de presse magazine, des salles de concert, des réseaux de salles de cinéma, les magasins relais que vous connaissez dans les aéroports ou les gares, et où là, Bolloré peut mettre en valeur tous ces journaux et ces livres d'extrême droite. En France, on compare beaucoup Vincent Bolloré à Rupert Murdoch, le magnat australo-américain, qui vous connaissez à la tête de l'empire médiatique de Fox News au Sun, fait lui aussi la promotion des discours les plus conservateurs. Comment Bolloré a fait pour en arriver là? Il a cédé ses activités de logistique, notamment en Afrique, et les syndicalistes se sont beaucoup battus contre les pratiques de M. Bolloré quand il possédait les ports, les trains en Afrique, où on a compté des centaines de morts parmi ses salariés à l'époque. Il a tout vendu pour axer son groupe sur les médias et l'édition. Et à chaque acquisition de M. Bolloré, c'est le même scénario qui se passe. On met le cap éditorial à droite toute, pour ne pas dire à l'extrême droite. Ça a été le cas de la chaîne Canal+, de la chaîne d'information CNews, où tous les jours, vous avez maintenant à l'écran en France des thématiques sécuritaires et migratoires qui reviennent en boucle, où on assiste tous les jours aussi à un racisme décomplexé. Par exemple, hier soir, vous aviez quelqu'un en plateau qui vous disait que, attention, méfiez-vous, quand vous prenez l'avion à l'aéroport de Roissy-Charles de Gaulle à Paris, ceux qui vous font passer les contrôles et vérifient les bagages sont tous des musulmans, beaucoup radicalisés, et qu'il faut se méfier car ils pourraient mettre des bombes, et donc c'est un scandale qu'ils puissent nous contrôler dans les aéroports. Donc l'objectif de Bolloré est de permettre à l'extrême droite d'arriver au pouvoir en engageant une bataille culturelle contre les gauchistes, les wokistes et les islamos, tout ce que vous voulez. Avec ses médias, ses maisons d'édition, il cherche à droitiser encore plus le débat public, en utilisant comme Trump, comme aux États-Unis, comme ça a pu être dit, la post-vérité, où on assène des choses totalement fausses, qui sont des idées farfelues, mais qui sont dites, redites, et qu'on le fait passer pour la vérité. Évidemment, tout cela est porté par des réseaux sociaux qui, en France, sont gangrénés par l'extrême droite. Et d'ailleurs, ça questionne beaucoup de mouvements syndicaux. Comment répondre à cette offensive réactionnaire sur les réseaux sociaux? Je n'évoque même pas le débat de X et d'Elon Musk. Et évidemment, Bolloré, c'est aussi une violence sociale inouïe dans ces entreprises où si vous n'êtes pas d'accord, à chaque fois, c'est pareil, c'est la porte et on assiste au grand remplacement où tous les journalistes, quand Bolloré arrive, quittent le journal et Bolloré les remplace par des journalistes aux idées d'extrême droite. Le deuxième milliardaire, il est un peu moins riche, même si sa fortune progresse très vite. Il est aujourd'hui 81e milliardaire français avec 1,6 milliard d'euros. Il a gagné quand même 200 millions en une année. C'est un milliardaire qui s'appelle Pierre-Édouard Sterrin et il a fait fortune avec Smartbox, une entreprise de coffrets cadeaux. Et c'est déjà la première chose, sachez que M. Sterrin est exilé depuis 10 ans en Belgique pour des raisons fiscales, car comme cela, il paye moins d'impôts. Alors, dès 2022, ce milliardaire avait confié vouloir consacrer l'intégralité de sa fortune au redressement de la France et à la promotion du Christ. Et tout cela a été révélé en 2024 par le journal L'Humanité, qui a révélé qu'il a créé un plan qui s'appelle Périclès pour servir et sauver la France et permettre la victoire idéologique, électorale et politique, une victoire d'un ensemble de valeurs, liberté, enracinement, identité, anthropologie chrétienne, évidemment contre les maux principaux de notre pays, le socialisme, le wokisme, l'islamisme et l'immigration, évidemment. Et donc ce plan prévoit de déployer 150 millions d'euros sur les 10 prochaines années via le financement ou la création de projets. Ce plan s'appelle Périclès. Périclès, ça veut dire patriote, enraciné, résistant, identitaire, chrétien, libéraux et souverainistes. Et donc, il faut essayer de faire une union des droites pour gagner, et en particulier aux élections municipales. Nous avons les élections municipales en France en mars 2026, dans quelques mois. Le but de M. Sterrin est que le principal parti d'extrême droite français gagne un minimum de 300 villes en mars 2026. Et ce monsieur Sterrin, il prévoit aussi de reverser donc encore 80 millions d'euros à plusieurs projets, dont certains ont été engagés. Vous allez voir, j'en ai 4 ici. L'animation d'abord d'une guérilla juridique à travers un collectif d'avocats afin d'organiser et professionnaliser le contentieux stratégique en utilisant les leviers judiciaires médiatiques contre l'immigration, l'islamisme, l'attaque à la liberté d'expression, c'est le fameux free speech en anglais, et la théorie du genre. Le document évoque l'objectif de lancement de plus de 20 procédures par an afin de faire changer la peur de camp. Et c'est ça leur objectif, faire changer la peur de camp. Comme si nous leur faisions peur. Enfin bon. La création après d'un think tank Victoire politique, qui doit devenir le premier think tank de droite en France, afin d'influencer les hauts fonctionnaires et la sphère politique médiatique. La création d'une école des futurs maires et d'élus afin de créer un groupe de personnel politique d'extrême droite, et donc toujours avec l'objectif de gagner 300 villes en 2026, et le rachat d'une école de journalisme pour fournir des journalistes d'extrême droite à l'ensemble des médias rachetés par l'extrême droite. Alors évidemment, on assiste à chaque fois chez ces deux milliardaires à une guerre contre les implantations syndicales. À chaque fois, c'est très dur de rester dans ces entreprises quand vous êtes un syndicat, et alors je ne vous parle pas quand vous êtes à la CGT. Ils participent aussi, bien sûr, par leur bataille culturelle et idéologique, à diviser les travailleurs et à stigmatiser les plus marginalisés en cherchant, comme d'habitude avec l'extrême droite, des boucs émissaires. Enfin, je voudrais terminer par dire que la bataille idéologique est très difficile en France en raison de la mainmise des milliardaires sur l'information qui possèdent 80% des médias, et donc nous luttons à la CGT pour un renforcement très fort des lois anti-concentration. La lutte continue. Merci.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Incredibly powerful intervention there. Obviously, we're short on time for questions, and I haven't covered Palantir yet, but I also think we've had an incredibly active chat. So if you are a speaker, I would refer you to the chat. You'll see people asking you questions, some who want to connect, some who have follow-up. There's not a lot of content questions, so that's good. I don't think we're leaving anybody out. But I did want to summarize a bit of what we've talked about. We didn't get into Palantir so much because we didn't have our colleagues from Progressive International here. But something Emmanuel said about Sterran really resonated, which is this merger of a sort of Christian ultranationalism and the far right. And we see this all over in my country. Um, but there's Peter Thiel, who is the founder and owner of Palantir, also has adopted this sort of worldview. He is both somebody who has said, and I'll quote directly from our own report here, he has said in his own manifesto, not a reporter covering it, in his own words, that he no longer believes that freedom and democracy are compatible. He said elsewhere that his primary concern is freedom, which tells you what he thinks about democracy. He's also currently doing a multi-part speaking series on the Antichrist, um, while he is backing things like Anduril, another company on our list, while he's amassed over $1 billion in U.S. military contracts, while he's being employed by the Trump administration to pull together a national database in the U.S., not only to track migrants in real time and help guide agents in whether to deport them, but also to look at citizens. There was just this past week introduced in the United States a piece of legislation that would give the Department of State the right to revoke the passports of American citizens who are critical of a recently assassinated right-wing figure, Charlie Kirk, which of course is a violation of the American First Amendment and so many other freedoms, regardless of how you feel about that individual or what happened, the tragic thing that happened to them. But the software that enables that kind of tracking is the Palantir Foundry software that is being deployed to gather this national database in the US. He's also, to what Susie talked about earlier, he's really using these sort of think tanks. He funds something called the New American Industrial Alliance, which is advised by Trump figures and is also seeking to dismantle labor and environmental regulation so they can speed up production of weapons. And again, like we've heard again, like so many people from Cote d'Ivoire to Namibia have mentioned in the chat, this is not just an American problem. Palantir has contracts in the UK with the NHS of all places, which have been subject to controversy for years. He's described apartheid South Africa, where he grew up and where I live. And this is Peter Thiel, or not where I live, where I am right now. Sorry. He's described apartheid South Africa as a sound economic system, which of course is one that we all as an international peace and trade union movements work so hard to overcome. But I also really want to focus on the things that you've talked about or were implicit and how unions are fighting back. You've heard from both CGT and CUT Brazil. They're really focused on their elections next year and guarding against and inoculating workers and voters against the attacks that they expect from these people. There's nobody who's surprised. None of the trade unions are surprised by this. They're very clear-eyed and they're working on developing strategies to push back. I think what Emmanuel said at the end is really the message that we hope people take away from the corporate underminers of democracy, which is that it's time to act. The premium right now is on action. The premium is to build the mass support that's required to take back democracy from these billionaires and to ensure that they don't seize any more of the territory that rightfully belongs to all working people in democracies, whether that's in the workplace, in society, or in global institutions. We are closing up on time, and I don't want to push our incredible interpreters any longer. I know many of us have spoken quite quickly, but now is indeed the time to act. I've put in the chat links to Uni Global's Amazon Global Union Alliance, to the Make Amazon Pay, to Africa Tech Workers Rising, to the common statement we did with ICANN. The ITUC is in action mode. And you hear from the colleagues on the phone today, we're all in action mode. We hope if you're listening that you'll join us. If you're already in a union, that means going, volunteering, stepping up to a position in your union to fight back. If you are not in a union yet, you've got a lot of great people on this phone, or you can find them through the ITUC's website that are ready to help you organize a union where you work. We have recently launched a global organizing partnership with Organizing for Power. You can go to the ITUC's website and find out more on that. But with thanks to all of our speakers, especially to Sonia for her stories really from the front line and what it's like, and for her contributions to the chat in reaction to the others, to Nick for always giving us the latest crimes that Amazon is committing that must be confronted, to Susie for giving us a perspective of ICANN and the peace movement on some of these legacy companies and the role that they're playing, to Contino, and to Emmanuel for briefing us all on the situation and the threat that these billionaires and these companies pose. At the end of the day, what we are trying to communicate in the corporate underminers of democracy is that there's a vicious cycle here. There's a direct relationship between the bargaining table or the organizing drive of a trade union, between the profits that their employers extract, and between how those employers then use those profits either directly from the company or through their CEOs and executives to finance the very people who are undermining us. It is a vicious cycle, and we must break it. And the ITUC is proud to be with all of you in that fight. So with that, we'll say thank you. Wish you all a good day. Please go to the ITUC's website and read the report if you haven't.